Hi there, I'm Michelle DeRusha. I'm the author of Spiritual Misfit, a memoir of uneasy faith, and I'm doing a series of short videos, just reading a few snippets of my book here and there, and talking about the story around those particular passages. So today I'm going to read you a little story about an incident that happened in our backyard many years ago with my two kids when they were both quite young. And it's really a story about the importance of asking questions, big questions, hard questions. And this was something that I avoided for a long time in my faith journey and in my walk back toward God, which was, as some of you know, very slow process. And I think that's an important point to remember in conversion stories. I think sometimes we are often looking for the lightning strike conversion story where everything is all wrapped up and neatly tied up with a shiny red ribbon, and it doesn't always work that way, and sometimes it's a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and that is the way it was for me. And so I'm going to read this little story about how my children actually helped me to start asking some important questions, and questions that I had really suppressed for and avoided for a long time. So this is from the chapter entitled In Search of Church. I was the parent who refused to use the word die during Noah's first 3 years, opting instead for the euphemism past its prime, as in, oh honey, that grasshopper, the one baked in the sun to the consistency of a Pringle with an army of ants hauling it away limb by limb, yeah, that grasshopper is just a bit past its prime. During his toddler years, Noah would observe, nod, and move on, clearly not processing my ridiculous explanation. As he got older, though, he was no longer satisfied with my vague euphemisms and my refusal to talk about death. In fact, the day I stopped using the phrase past its prime was the day Noah asked pointedly, Mommy, are you past your prime? Yeah, not a great question. I didn't want to talk about death with my kids because I didn't have any answers to the questions I knew would follow, such as, where do we go when we die? And do you believe in heaven? Unfortunately, though, kids are curious about everything, including mortality, so they continued to press the issue. And I recall one incident in particular that forced me to talk about death with them in a very real and personal way. Throughout the winter, we had observed a large cocoon dangling, like a leather satchel, from the river birch tree. We weren't confident it contained a hibernating creature. Rowan, an active toddler at the time, had prodded it too vigorously a couple of times, batting it like a miniature tetherball, so we didn't have high hopes for its metamorphosis. Nevertheless, one May evening, Noah stormed into the house, shouting, the Cecropia moth is here, and we all dashed out to take a look. The moth's body was furry and plump, like a tiny fruit bat with a wingspan as wide as my hand. 2 bushy antennae sprung from its head, and on its intricately patterned wings shone 2 yellow spots like owl eyes. It dangled a few inches from its cocoon, gingerly folding and unfolding its giant wings, hairy legs twitching a little as they clung to the branch. The gargantuan fuzzy moth gave me the major creeps, but the boys were mesmerized, standing so close beneath it that their noses nearly touched the moth's feathery wings as it hung upside down from the twig. They galloped up the sidewalk to summon our neighbors John and Karna, and we all posed for photos with the moth as if it were Julia Roberts suspended from the tree. The 6 of us stood around the river birch for 20 minutes admiring the creature before it was time for the boys to head in reluctantly for a bath. The next morning, when the kids ran outside to inspect the moth, they discovered it was gone. We assumed its wings had warmed in the morning sun and it had flown away, but later that afternoon we learned the moth had met a different fate. Noah, who had been roaming the yard, suddenly screamed out, covering his face with one hand and pointing at the wood chips with the other. There on the ground lay what was left of the moth, its bat body torn in 2. Just a bit of the head remained. The shell of it, actually, its innards presumably extracted by the probing beak of a hungry bird. 2 wings lay scattered in ragged pieces on the wood chips. Noah crumpled to the ground, sobbing, rocking back and forth on his knees as I hugged him. He cried for 20 minutes straight, pausing only to inquire why I wasn't crying too. Rowan offered his brother sympathy, wandering over to give Noah a hug before running after the soccer ball, sing-songing, "A bird ate it, but not the wings, but not the wings." Totally not helpful. As his crying eased into a few sliding tears, Noah's questions began. How did the moth feel when he died? Is the moth in heaven now? Do moths have a separate heaven from people? Will I see him when I go to heaven someday? Will I recognize him there? What if there are other moths that look just like him, and I can't tell which one is my moth? I tried to work through his questions and offered comfort, but it was hard. Not only was my heart breaking for his loss, I also didn't really know what to say. I was so afraid I would instill in Noah the same paralyzing fear of death I'd had as a child. I sat on the warm grass with Noah's head against my chest, and I realized that inside I was asking many of the same plaintive questions about death and the afterlife, and I didn't have any answers. As I fumbled through weak explanations to my son, I felt like I was constructing a pastor of Paris theology, throwing together a glumpy hodgepodge of rambling thoughts as I went along. Where is Brad, the man with the divinity degree, when I need him? I fumed to myself. Why does a waffler always get these questions? Finally, I resorted to the truth. Honey, I just don't know, I admitted. I told Noah there was so much about God and heaven and how it all worked that we didn't or couldn't really know. I told him that sometimes we had to try to be satisfied with not knowing all the answers, satisfied with the knowledge that someday, if we had the opportunity to hang out with God face to face, we would understand. The explanation was vague, and I certainly wasn't sure I believed it myself, but it was the best I could offer Noah at the time. I wasn't about to admit to my young son that I wasn't even sure I believed in God. I didn't want to plant the seed of unbelief in his head too. We decided not to bury the moth. While I advocated vigorously for a dignified funeral beneath the columbine flowers, mostly because I couldn't bear the thought of my son hunched over the moth wings for the rest of the day, Noah refused. Instead, he carefully lifted a wing out of the wood chips, blew gently off the dust, and carried it in a cupped palm to his room. Later, I found it pinned to his bulletin board with a thumbtack, the yellow owl eye glaring eerily from the corkboard. I also spied a slip of paper on Noah's bedside table. On it, in his scraggly first-grade penmanship, was written, "Moth, I love you." We sometimes laugh about that story a little bit. Rowan, of course, was so young, he doesn't remember it, but he loves the fact that he was kind of running around the yard sing-songing that a bird had eaten Noah's pet. And it's cute, you know. We just remember how Noah had written Moth, M-O-F, Moth, I love you, on that little slip of paper next to his bed. But I love this story because I think it illustrates the importance of asking questions, the necessity of asking questions. Big questions, hard questions, questions that we sometimes don't want to face, questions that we don't have answers to, and honestly may never have answers to. For so long, I avoided asking any questions like that at all. I used to tell my husband I don't do deep questions, which is such a ridiculous thing to say in retrospect, but I was 100% in avoidance, just suppressing those questions because I was afraid of them. And I think even some of us who have a deep faith and are firmly grounded in faith are afraid to ask questions because we feel like somehow those questions are indicative of a lack of faith or of the fact that our faith is not strong enough or real enough. And I just don't think that that's true. I think that it's important to ask questions and to ask God those questions, to ask those questions of ourselves and to ask God those questions too. Because really, you know, that's conversation and that is relationship with God. And I believe that he would much prefer those kinds of questions, even the doubting, disbelieving, unbelieving questions, because that is a continuing of the conversation and a continuing of that relationship. And even though it might be a hard part of that relationship, it's still communication with God, which is better than what I did for 20 years, which was shutting down communication entirely and pretending that I didn't have those questions and that I didn't need to ask any questions. So that's the message that I want to encourage you with today. Ask the questions if you are feeling them in your heart, or if you know somebody that is maybe struggling through a period of questions and doubt, or even unbelief in their faith. Just ask them, or suggest to them, that they begin asking themselves and asking God some of those hard questions. And I believe that in the seeking answers, maybe not the answers that you expected or even hoped for, but answers will come. Thanks so much. It's good to be with you today.